Harold Bloom is here. He is the Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale University and Berg Professor of English at New York University. He has written more than 20 books, including the Western Canon, the Book of Jay, and Genius. His most recent book is Hamlet, Poem Unlimited. I am pleased to welcome a great friend of this broadcast back to this table. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Charles.
Hamlet for you is what?
Well, it is certainly the most extraordinary single work of Western literature that I have ever read in any language that I can read.
Why is that?
It's a kaleidoscope. It's of no genre whatsoever, which is why, following Polonius, I only half ironically subtitled the book Poem Unlimited.
Let me interrupt you by saying this is from Polonius. The best actors in the world, either for tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, comical, historical, pastoral, tragical, historical, comical, historical, pastoral, seen indivisible, or
Poem Unlimited, yes.
That from Polonius.
And Shakespeare, who was an endless tragic ironist, puts in Polonius's mouth the whole question of what genre he is writing, because this is no revenge tragedy. It is, as I say in the book, Shakespeare's revenge upon revenge tragedy. It is a cosmological drama, even though its protagonist, its hero of apotheosis, as I would call him finally, rather than a tragic figure, seems to resent the play that he's been placed in. It's as though he demands a cosmological drama from Shakespeare, and Shakespeare tries to pull away from it. I mean, that was to come, of course, in King Lear and Macbeth. But in this play, he was doing something very different, and so far as I can see, endlessly personal. His son, whose name was Hamlet, a difference between an N and an L in those days of free orthography would not have mattered. His only son, was dead a few years before. His father had just died. When he writes this play and then revises it somewhat in 1601, first in 1600 and then 1601, he is, I think, and this is only a surmise, but we need to make surmises of this kind, he is searching for something in himself, something that will suffice, perhaps. And what he comes up with does not altogether make him happy. His protagonist, his hero, as it were, is an amazingly mixed being. I cannot think of anyone in the entire history of literature, just as, one knows a great many people. One has been teaching for 50 years. I calculated the other day when I was lying in a hospital bed, from which I have fortunately been resurrected, that I had by now taught some 35,000 separate individuals, which is, almost crushing in a way, because when worries come, one really knows so many people. I have never met a person and never encountered a literary figure who is able to combine absolute contraries, really contradictions, as Hamlet does. He is at once more given to theatricality than any other figure, and yet also given to a kind of terrifying inwardness, which keeps growing and growing further and further into the deeps. And that's an amazing combination. How can you be totally theatrical and totally inward? I think you reach a point in this amazing play at the end of the fourth act where something breaks apart in him. The theatricality goes one way, the inwardness goes in quite another. And when he shows up again after a sea change in Act 5, quite literally a sea change, because it seems to happen when he's out at sea and prevents being taken off to England for execution by the order of his ghastly uncle by simply jumping ship, though taking care in his very dangerous and I think rather nasty way to see that his old college roommates, as we would say these days, the wretched and hapless Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, are off to England to be executed in his place. He is a dangerous figure. He is responsible before this play is over for 8 deaths, including his own. He seems to be utterly debonair about it. He is almost always misread by our critical tradition. But
he's always misread by our critical tradition.
I think so.
Meaning a whole series of
I'm afraid so.
English-speaking critics have failed to get it?
Well, there are honorable partial exceptions like Dr. Johnson, who, however, did not like the play and did not like the character. There's William Hazlitt, who said brilliantly, "It is we ourselves who are Hamlet." But that begs too many questions, magnificent figure as he is. There was H.E. Bradley, who wisely said that this fellow was his own Falstaff. Hamlet, I would add, he's also his own Iago. He doesn't need an Iago. But he is a dangerous person. He does not love anyone. He's not capable of love. That may indeed be why audiences fall in love with him, or why everyone in the play, even if they dread him, are in some strange way in love with him. He is a charismatic, but he is a charismatic without doctrine.
Do we have evidence that Shakespeare considered him his best work, his best character?
The evidence would seem to indicate, the only clear evidence we have are how many quartos, that is to say single volumes, both authorized and unauthorized, came out involving a particular play and its protagonist. The evidence shows that there were more quartos of Henry IV, Part 1, totally dominated by one's other hero, Sir John Falstaff, and Hamlet. They indeed seem to have been his most popular plays, though he was, of course, a great entertainer. It remains a wonderful oddity of cultural tradition in the broadest sense that the world's, so far as I can tell, certainly the Western world's greatest single writer, someone who, in a sense, finally, and this is almost impossible, you ought not to be able to differ in kind from other writers, but pragmatically, there's such a difference in degree between Shakespeare and even Dante, Cervantes, Tolstoy, Chaucer, and so on, that pragmatically he does become different in kind. That the world's greatest dramatist, the world's greatest thinker, really, I think one would have to say, because he transcends philosophy, transcends Plato, transcends Montaigne, should also have been the world's greatest entertainer, or as Ralph Waldo Emerson said of him a little ruefully, the master of the revels to mankind. A very difficult phenomenon to try to catch up with.
After he wrote Hamlet, did he change? Did he?
I think he did. Without Hamlet, you would not have had the really terrifying succession of plays, almost too painful to contemplate. Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. Then, almost as though with tremendous relief and release, he writes Antony and Cleopatra. But it has all cost him something.
Cost him what?
Cost him, I think, something of his own capacity for endurance. I think that the isolation of Hamlet as a figure, and he's absolutely in the end isolated from everyone else in the play. They're all intensely concerned about him. The critical tradition says he's in love with his mother. You know, that's Freud's notion. So much nonsense. Here he is, and his poor mother, just poisoned, is dying and cries out, "Oh, my dear Hamlet," and his farewell to her is, "Wretched queen, adieu," as if to say, "So much for you, sweetheart." This is a ruthless,
wretched queen, adieu.
Adieu, yes, to say to one's dying mother.
Well, that doesn't. What does that say to you? Is that Freudian or just simply?
No, I don't think it's Freudian
meanness
at all. Meanness. He's too grand to be considered in terms, of moral good and evil. He's too grand to be considered in terms of generosity or meanness. He's also incredibly
But
various.
that's what makes interesting characters, is they have within them, the deepest contradictions, as you said, as well as the tragic flaws that make them seem, that takes away from their magnanimity.
Yes, and that is well phrased. He has the greatness that you speak of. The flaws, however, may or may not be tragic, but they are multiform, and he knows it. But what he has above everything else is the incredible gift of consciousness. He is more, without being self-conscious in our terminology, he is more conscious of his own consciousness and of the problems of consciousness than anyone else in the entire history of literature, as far as I can tell, in life, setting Shakespeare aside. Of personal information about Shakespeare, of what you might want to call Shakespeare's own inwardness, we know nothing.
Right.
We never will know anything.
I never have understood why that was.
I think
He left no letters. He left no record.
we have endless legal records. He was a man very quick with lawsuits.
But that was commerce, and
that was pure commerce. He was a great businessman. No, he would not expose his inwardness. He seems to have been someone who kept himself, though a good fellow, and getting along with his fellow dramatists for the most part in the world of actors and theater people. He seems to have been someone who really kept to himself.
But no diary.
No diary, no familiar letters.
Yeah.
We have some anecdotes that I'm inclined to believe. The most startling one is the tradition, which for me holds a great deal of credence. He had retired from writing, retired from the London theater. The last almost 3 years of his life, he lived with his family again in Stratford. Just before his death, at the not very ripe old age of 52, just about the time of his 52nd birthday.
That's all we've got there.
Yeah, his old friends, Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton, came up from London to have a night of serious drinking with him. The next day, they went back to London as blithe as ever. He took to his sickbed and was dead within 36 hours. What this all means, I don't know. The late Tony Burgess, who wrote, I think in some ways, the best biography of Shakespeare, a wonderful
Anthony
novel.
Burgess?
Yes, a wonderful novel called Nothing Like the Sun.
Yeah.
He would always tell me, and it's in his novel also, that he thought Shakespeare in the end died so young because of the consequences of syphilis.
Really?
Well, it is true that...
They seem to attribute syphilis to a lot of historical characters.
Well, I know, but in Timon of Athens, a play that he writes but then will not put on, never put it on stage, in fact. In Timon of Athens, there are tremendous curses by Timon urging whores whom he is heaping with gold.
How old was he?
At that point, just a few years before the end, perhaps he was 47 or 48 at that point.
Let me bring this back to Hamlet. Hamlet is, some say, a combination of Prince Hal and Falstaff.
Yeah, I myself have said that, and yet, Falstaff is as witty as Hamlet, but Falstaff, in the end, even if you wouldn't want to spend the night drinking with him, because he would certainly pick your pocket and who knows what else he would do to you, Falstaff is genial and benign compared to Hamlet. Prince Hal is neither genial nor benign, particularly in his incarnation as Henry V. He is a power monger and a great employer of power and of warfare. But Hamlet is a dramatist. He is a poet. He is, to this day, our most persuasive representation in all of literature of what we have learned to call an intellectual. Indeed, he is the only literary character. This is something that has bemused me for years, but I've tried to work it out in this little book. He is the only character in all of literature who seems to have an authorial consciousness all his own, so that you want to quote him on all sorts of matters the way you would quote Emerson or Montaigne or...
The way you would quote authors.
Yes. In that sense, again, he is a very alarming kind of a figure. And his play, which is already Shakespeare's longest at 4,000 lines, and his part in it is longer than anybody else's part. He speaks fully 3 lines out of 8 in the course of the play.
Where is Shakespeare's voice in this?
For once you actually do hear Shakespeare's voice, when Hamlet is giving his instructions to the players, before they're going to put on his revised murder of Gonzago, the mousetrap in which he intends to catch Claudius, he admonishes the players, in particular the player king or first player, a part that we believe many of us Shakespeare himself played, because it doubles very naturally with the ghost. But there is Richard Burbage, the prime actor of the company, for whom Shakespeare wrote, on stage, playing the part of Hamlet, but surely speaking for once in Shakespeare's own voice when he says, "Speak the speech, as I have writ it, trippingly on the tongue. Do not soar the hands," he says to the actors, "with empty gestures. Do not make such a concern of yourself. Don't get in the way of what I have written."
Exactly.
Surely, for once, in those 38 dramas, we hear the authentic voice of Shakespeare himself.
Did this play change between its first version and its last?
We will never recover the first version. Most of critical tradition has insisted, and I think wrongly, that the play that we don't have, I'm so full of medicines
I
that
know
I
you
get
are.
dry mouth. my dear.
I'm delighted to be able to provide you as much water as we have.
I am pleased. There was an original Hamlet, the so-called Or Hamlet. It could have been as early as 1587 or as late as 1589. Scholars usually attribute it to Thomas Kyd, the author of the Spanish tragedy. I think they're wholly mistaken. I think it was one of Shakespeare's first plays,
Yeah.
that he was not happy about it, and that he finally goes back to the same subject when he is fully mature, when he's 37 or 38, 1600 or 1601, and writes Hamlet all over again, probably with very little reference to the original one. But he never lets it alone after that. After his death, the first folio is published. It has a text of Hamlet lacking a good deal of what is in the authorized second quarto, but adding a great deal that we don't have, so that to get the complete or 4,000-line uncut Hamlet, you have to make what scholars call a diplomatic text out of the two, which doesn't really work. I think Shakespeare, it was his white elephant. I think he could not get away from it.
All right. Your first, I don't want to now shift to productions of Hamlet.
Certainly.
Not an actor that I've ever interviewed, and I've interviewed many of the great ones,
Yes.
has ever said to me, has always said to me that Macbeth is much more difficult to play than Hamlet.
Charlie, you know better than I do that in the world of the actors and actresses, Macbeth, by tradition, is considered the unluckiest play there ever was. I mean, famous actors' encouragement, break a leg, becomes literally true.
Yes.
People die on the sets of Macbeth. But I think Macbeth is a shot out of hell. It's a great economical drama, except for the Comedy of Errors. It's Shakespeare's shortest play. But great as it is, shocking as it is, it doesn't really equal Hamlet. T.S. Eliot, in his very worst moment as a literary critic, and he had many terribly bad moments, once announced in an essay on Hamlet that it was most certainly an aesthetic failure, to which one could only say, if Hamlet, the play, is an aesthetic failure, there has never been such a thing as an aesthetic success, because this is, I repeat, simply the most fascinating literary work that any of us will ever know.
All right. Gielgud it was Gielgud Hamlet that you first saw.
Yes.
You came, as I remember this, and this is all the deep recesses of my mind, you were born yourself. Your parents were Russian immigrants.
Yes, Russian Jewish immigrants.
Settled in the Bronx.
Yes.
And you were born in the Bronx around 1930?
1930,
Yeah.
July 11th, 1930. Grew up speaking Yiddish, taught myself English, which is why to this day it sounds so odd. As George Bernard Shaw rightly said, the orthography, the spelling of English has nothing to do with the way it's pronounced.
You then saw Gielgud
I saw Gielgud,
as Hamlet.
yes, in the same year, or perhaps the next year, I saw something which stayed with me longer. Rafe Richardson playing both parts of Henry IV against Olivier's Hotspur in the afternoon and Olivier's Shallow in the second part in the evening. But Gielgud remains, in terms of the inner ear, in terms of hearing the way Hamlet should sound, the spookiest and most remarkable memory that I have, though in terms of stage business. But since then, I have seen scores of Hamlets, and one is never satisfied.
One is never satisfied after seeing Gielgud, or one is never satisfied because no one can do justice to the play?
Certainly, one's ear, one's aesthetic apprehension that comes through the inner ear was more than gratified by John Gielgud. But there are so many Hamlets that even if 50,000 actors, and indeed actresses occasionally, play him, we will not come to the end of him. Almost any interpretation in some sense is valid, because the figure is like trying to hold Quicksilver, trying to hold on to his consciousness. He leaps sometimes in 3 or 4 lines from the most sublime diction to sort of lowly diction. He is supposedly overwhelmed by encountering his father's ghost, but he starts calling him in a moment or two Old Mole and True Penny, or even mockingly refers to him, since he's below stage at that point, of the ghost, as this fellow in the cellarage. There is nothing constant about Hamlet. It is a mind so totally vivacious, so profoundly vital, that it's always at work reinventing itself. So in a sense, you know, we need as many directors and as many actors for Hamlet as we can get.
Okay, so Kenneth Branagh did the 5-hour version, which is the complete text.
Certainly courageous on his part. I remarked somewhere in this little book that finally I think the director and the Hamlet, the actor who plays Hamlet, have to be at war with one another, that one of them has to take the part of Shakespeare and the other the part of Hamlet, because I think that Shakespeare himself is at war with Hamlet by the time he reaches the 5th act. Shakespeare must have experienced before the phenomenon of characters just getting away from him, the way Falstaff runs away from him, the way Shylock, to some strong extent, runs away from him. But he cannot have been unaware that Hamlet totally gets away from him, you know, has a life of his own, is a kind of rival playwright within the play itself.
That he had created something that went beyond his own character.
Yeah. And though perhaps it is a clue to his character.
You've never bought the idea that Shakespeare did not write.
That
His
is
own
the
work.
most insane idea I've ever heard. The so-called Oxfordians hate me deeply. I get hate mail from them all the time, because some years ago when Lewis Lapham was running a symposium in Harper's on the supposed controversy, I wrote a piece called A Salvo for Lucy Negro, that being the name by which, I mean nothing invidious by that. She was an East Indian lady and considered to be the leading whore and madam in Shakespeare's London. Indeed, in Tony Burgess's novel, Nothing Like the Sun, she is the dark lady of the sonnets, with whom Shakespeare and his perhaps love, the Earl of Southampton, as it were, competed, or rather for whom they competed, though I must say on the basis of the sonnets, Shakespeare is remarkably detached in regard to what is going on there.
Tell me this. You actually played Falstaff on stage.
Ah, yes, 3 times. Once at full length, thanks to Robert Brustein and the wonderful director, Karen
Directed
Coonrod.
the Yale School of
No, this was at the Harvard Repertory some years ago. Since then, I've done a number of scenes in a shorter version, and again, I've done it to some extent here with the Shakespeare Society in New York. I have, however, due to my latest illnesses, already lost some 40-odd pounds, and will hope to lose another 60 in the
You're
next
too
year and a
thin for
half or so. Yes, I'm afraid I will no longer qualify.
Here's my, I should say you had bypass surgery.
Well,
You're doing okay.
I'm doing fine.
Thanks to a very fine doctor at Yale.
Superb, doctor.
You're going strong teaching at Yale. You're still teaching at NYU.
Yes.
You live in New York and you make the journey back and forth.
Live primarily in New Haven,
And
also
then make
live
the
in New
journey back
York
and
with
forth.
my
Okay.
wife, yes.
The Shakespeare, for a man of your mind and your literary instincts, must have been the greatest thing ever happened to you.
From the time I was a boy, I mean, I started with other poets like William Blake and Lord Crane, but as soon as I had read Macbeth, as soon as I'd read Romeo and Juliet, as soon as I read Hamlet and King Lear and Othello, it was all over with me. That is to say,
That's when the love affair began,
when it's totally
or was in
overwhelmed.
full bloom. Is he best at tragedy or comedy?
In the symposium, Socrates is sitting there after a night of serious drinking, and he is sitting there with the dramatist Agathon, and one other fellow has still not fallen asleep. And Socrates propounds the theory that a great writer for the stage should be equally good at comedy and tragedy. We have no such figures in Athens. We have great tragic writers, Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles. We have Aristophanes, still perhaps the greatest comic playwright, short of Shakespeare, we've ever had. But Shakespeare is unique. Molière writes comedy.
Molière writes
Don Juan goes a little towards tragedy.
So you're saying that you can't choose. He was just very good at both.
Twelfth Night is as powerful a drama almost as Hamlet. As You Like It is as winning a thing as the two parts of Henry IV. This is the unique figure.
It's Hamlet, Poem Unlimited, Harold Bloom. May you live forever. Thank you for being with us.
May you too
as
live
always.
forever, dear fellow. Thank you.